That's great. Well, and it sounds like you kind of have developed a vision for, the who you want to be when you grow up kind of thing, where, you've really spent the time to say, what's our niche going to be? Where are we going to focus our attention? And then you can really focus your resources on moving in that direction, that you have done the research, you have, had your pro forma, you have looked at the business model, the financial modeling, and say, this is a way that we can be sustainable. And it seems like that vision then really guides you in your next move. Is that reflective of kind of the process that you've gone through?
It is reflective. One other thing that I have to add is that on the reservation and within federal territories, the rules are different, right? You have different jurisdictions, you have different land status. And then once we cross over to that threshold, it now becomes state jurisdiction, if you will. So we have to operate differently in those areas. So do we need, a CLEC or an ETC status? State taxes might apply. I mean, so there's so many different things. So we have to pair those two different types of business models and requirements in order to serve those areas. So that's something else to think about. I wouldn't let that be a barrier, but I just want that kind of highlighted, that there's going to be differences working on reservation as opposed to off. And I think the question might come later, but that comes with policy considerations and regulations. I've said this on many platforms, that from a state and federal level, there needs to be policy considerations for tribal providers. We don't fit the models of the larger telecoms, and we probably won't ever, because of the rural nature, because of our smaller, but that does not mean that we are not providing sound service equivalent to them. It's just from a different governmental structure. So I fully think that there's going to need to be a policy regulation on state and federal level for tribal providers.
So what do you think the best thing is that you have done in planning your tribal telecom program?
The best thing that I've done in planning, I would have to say the best thing that I've done in planning is creating a strong staff and employee base to help support the different functions. I think it's finding subject matter experts and consultants, because a lot of tribes and a lot of tribal employees are wearing many hats. And we talked about that internal capacity a little bit before. And it's not that we're not skilled and educated and, have those abilities. It's that, the workload is pretty daunting, and we're probably, doing 2 or 3 jobs, at one time. So I think the best thing that I could have done is develop that strong team and develop strong partnerships, because those can be long lasting. We've really tried to be selective of the consultants that we choose, because you're reliant on their expertise and guidance to help develop that. So I think making wise decisions on who you contract with is going to be a kind of a game changer across the board. You want a team that has integrity, that's invested, that, really cares about what they're doing and understanding the impact of spending those dollars and what that really means. So the best thing I think I could have done is that team structure, have a foundation around me, because it takes a village, including the consultants and the state and federal entities we work with, and developing those relationships.
I think that's something that is so important to kind of tease out of these conversations, is talking about, developing trust and developing those relationships, like you said, that then you can rely on each other as partners and you trust each other. And I think, NTTA is a great way to get some face time with people and start kind of trying to figure out who those people might be. Do you have, I know this is a little off script, but do you have any recommendations for really good ways you've found to find good and trustworthy partners?
So I really feel like that goes back to relationships that have been developed. Hoopa has had the opportunity to be a part of the broadband boot camps that have been integral to our development and process from the beginning. I've had a chance to attend, a handful of those. Spiggy has attended, and my staff has attended as well. And so it's really those peer relationships that when you're talking about developing trust, when you're talking about developing relationships, it's those recommendations from those people that say, hey, I know somebody that might be able to have that. And that's where I think the networking and the working together, bouncing ideas off of each other. Because you can submit an RFP and, you kind of get, random companies. So when the broadband awards were announced, I can't tell you how many cold calls we got and emails that we received from companies that we know nothing about.
Right.
And there were it was obvious that a lot of them didn't necessarily know how to work with tribes, and they kept, using phrases that weren't in alignment with us. So there's those cold calls. And then, like I said, you can submit an RFP, but I think it's really the relationships that we develop, like with structures like this that can recommend somebody. And those to me have been the long lasting relationships. Is to say, hey, I've worked with this group, let me get you in contact with them. And then they can make a decision if that consultant is right for them. And I think it really comes down to the energy and the people that you work with, such as yourself.
Thank you. And I do love that you point out that one right fit for one tribe or one organization may not be the right fit for another. And it can be a great trustworthy partner, but it does need to be a right fit. And so I think that is a really important part that, you can make a recommendation, but really it's up to the organization then to decide if it is the right fit team for them to accomplish the project that they're setting out to accomplish.
Mm-hmm. One thing I'll mention, though, is throughout the progression of these last 5 years, we have worked with several companies that the relationship didn't start out that great, right? Meaning like it was a difference of pairing a private company and a tribe. But I will say that those relationships, especially with honesty and talking about like, hey, you know what, we don't really operate in that manner. We really would like to see it this way. I do believe gut instinct goes a long way. And there are those relationships that can be developed and in the end be really strong. So I think that tribes need to take the lead and say, I understand that that's how you do things, but like here, this is how we would like to see our build go. This is for our people, our government, our lands, and be very forthcoming of being able to shape how we would like to see it.
So who supports you in your decision making?
So first, as with tribes, I have to go back to how we're structured. So Hoopa Public Utilities is a chartered tribal entity. We have an elected board of directors. So there are 5 people that are appointed as our governing body. And on top of that, coming from the Hoopa Valley Tribe, we have a chairperson seat and we have 7 tribal council members. So really the decision making really must come from the entity to the board level to tribal council level. Ultimately, it would be great on things to get stakeholder engagement and stakeholder feedback, because they're the reasons why we're receiving funding to be able to serve those footprints, to serve our tribal community. So I would say that our governing bodies help decision making, but I'm going to go back to my staff and the consultants that we've selected, because we can't possibly be experts on, everything from electronics to the equipment, to the overhead, to the tower climbing, to, everything that comes with that, the business pro forma, the auditing that comes with it. And I do have a strong staff. So I am very reliant on my staff's feedback as well, because I don't particularly work in their component. That's their position. So working with your staff, working with your consultants, to give you the best informed information to make decisions, I think is the best approach. Because I am reliant on outside. What I kind of prefer from a decision making is for people to lay out the pros and cons, so you can make informed decisions. Here's the information on this side, and then you can, kind of make decision one way or the other on what's the best move. And sometimes that's scary, but you also have to take leaps of faith.
Thank you. I love hearing just the structure for decision making and kind of how your team all works together to make decisions. It's not one person in isolation. And I think that's really important. And you brought it up several times, is to have a really good team around you, and then being responsible to your stakeholders, both in council and your governing board, as well as the end consumers and the tribal members. So what is your advice for other tribes to increase their chance of long-term sustainability for their tribal telecom programs?
So throughout this journey, we realized that tribes are in different processes with this. Some tribes are just in the planning phase, and that's very important because those feasibility studies are critical. And I told you kind of about our development, how we were seeking grants, and then all of a sudden COVID hit. So we didn't really have the opportunity to do a full-blown feasibility study and then make decisions. We, had to operate to provide critical communications during probably the worst pandemic we've seen in our lifetime. But I absolutely think that if there's time to do the feasibility study, what does this look like for your tribe? Are you going to work with the incumbent provider? Are you going to provide services yourself? Is there a combination of both? And really looking at what that looks like. We've really tried to make decisions for tribal ownership, supporting and training our own tribal staff, who are invested here. It's our families, it's our community. We're boots on the ground. And so I really think that long-term sustainability really starts with those planning efforts, finding strong partners, looking at the overhead costs, because that is going to be absolutely critical. Making strong partnerships with your federal and state partners, I think, is critical. Now that we're looking at digital equity efforts, there needs to be a next phase of, okay, now we have infrastructure in place, how are we going to maximize that? And I do think that has to come with policy considerations. A lot of the telecoms are given certain offsets and funding for, low income customers. And so they really need to look at how they can support tribal telecoms in that same manner without having to fit that structure. And that goes back to the policy and regulations and guidelines. So it's about developing strong partners, a strong team, having transparency and communication with governing bodies, tribal councils, your community. One thing I will say that is also something I wish we would have done from the beginning is that marketing component. Because you want to let and be communicating with your community that, hey, we're doing the environmental studies, but then the next 6 months, we'll be selecting a contractor. We'll be doing build outs, and we would really love your service because you absolutely need those customers to be sustainable. So that's one thing that I wish we had, like a marketing analyst to develop those, because that's going to be critical moving on. So the business aspect, the financial aspect, the team building, the training, business pro formas, and communication with your community, I think is kind of one recipe that is going to be necessary for long-term sustainability.